He protected the wrong woman, and the one he destroyed, she owned everything he ever touched. If you've made it this far, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what unfolds over the next 5 parts will make you question everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and the quiet people in the room that nobody watches. This is the story of Seraphine Vale, the woman everyone overlooked, the woman who ran it all. The envelope arrived at 7 in the morning, slipped beneath the door of Damien Viscari's private study while the household slept. By the time his personal assistant noticed it, the wax seal, a single black V pressed into burgundy, had already been photographed and transmitted to 4 separate analysts. By the time Damien himself held it, his jaw had gone tight in the way it always did when something arrived that he hadn't ordered. He stood at the window, still in his dress shirt from the night before, collar open, the city sprawling 20 stories below in its gray morning indifference. He read the contents once, then again. Then he folded the paper with the deliberate care of a man who had learned never to let his hand shake in front of anyone, even when no one was watching. The letter contained 12 words. You don't know what you're sitting on. You never did. No signature, no demands, no return address. Damien dropped it onto his desk, walked to the bar cart in the corner of the room, and poured 2 fingers of something amber before he remembered he hadn't eaten in 18 hours. He drank it anyway. The problem wasn't the letter. Men sent him cryptic letters on a semi-regular basis. They were usually dead within the week, or they wanted something. Money, protection, a seat at a table they hadn't been invited to. This letter fit none of those categories. There was no ask, no threat dressed up as a riddle. Just those 12 words sitting in his chest like a piece of glass he'd accidentally swallowed. He called his head of security. Renner answered on the second ring, voice already alert, already dressed. That was one of the things Damien paid for. Men who didn't need time to wake up. I need the outer gate footage from midnight to 6. Already pulling it, Renner said. Anything else? Damien looked at the folded letter. Find me whoever touched my door. He ended the call before Renner could answer, because the truth was that the letter wasn't the only thing sitting wrong in his chest this morning. There was something else. Something he'd been pressing down for weeks because pressing things down was what he did, what he'd been taught to do, what the business demanded of men who wanted to survive in it. Seraphine. His wife had been quiet at dinner last night, quieter than usual, which was saying something because Seraphine Vale, Seraphine Viscari, now, legally, though she'd never once introduced herself by his name, was the kind of woman who could be in a room for 3 hours and make you feel like you'd been alone the entire time. Not coldly, not rudely. She was never rude. She was simply elsewhere, even when she was present. A particular talent. He'd mistaken it, early on, for emptiness. He wasn't sure anymore what he mistook it for now. She had eaten exactly half her plate. She'd asked the housekeeper about the floral arrangement in the foyer, whether the roses were fresh or whether Dominguez had been cutting corners again. She'd looked at Damien exactly twice during the meal, both times when she was reaching for her water glass, and both times the look meant absolutely nothing and everything simultaneously, the way a locked door can tell you volumes about what the person on the other side doesn't want you to know. Celeste had called twice during dinner. Damien had let it go to voicemail both times, which he told himself was about propriety and not about the fact that Celeste's voice, lately, had started carrying a particular quality of pressure that he didn't enjoy. He'd deal with Celeste after breakfast, after the gate footage, after he figured out who the hell had delivered 12 words to his private study at 7 in the morning. He showered, changed, and walked downstairs to find Seraphine already in the garden. She was standing near the low stone wall at the garden's edge, coffee cup in hand, watching the groundskeeper trim the hedge line with more attention than the task warranted. She wore a pale gray wrap. Silk, he assumed. It was always silk. And her dark hair was pulled back at the nape of her neck with the ruthless efficiency she applied to everything about her appearance. No jewelry yet, no shoes, her bare feet on the flagstone. He paused in the doorway. He didn't know why he paused. It wasn't the first time he'd seen his wife in the garden. They'd been married 4 years, and she'd stood in that garden more mornings than he could count. But something about this particular morning, the gray light and the bare feet and the absolute stillness of her posture, made him stop. She turned before he stepped outside, as if she'd heard him standing there even through the glass. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He went to the coffee service on the outdoor table. She watched the hedge trimmer finish its pass and start another. She didn't say anything else, and he didn't either, and for approximately 3 minutes they occupied the same 10 feet of garden in the particular silence that had become the primary language of their marriage. Then his phone went off. Celeste's name on the screen. He felt Seraphine's attention shift, not toward the phone, she didn't look at it, but toward him, some small recalibration in her stillness that he caught only because he'd been standing close enough to notice. He took the call. "I've been trying to reach you," Celeste said, and her voice had that quality again, the compressed intensity of someone who'd been rehearsing what they wanted to say. "I know. What is it?" "I need to see you this morning. It's not something I can do over the phone." He looked at Seraphine's profile. Her coffee cup was halfway to her lips. She wasn't listening. Or she was listening in the particular way she did everything, completely, and without appearing to. "I'll be there by 10, he said. He ended the call, pocketed the phone. When he looked up, Seraphine was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, which was her most common expression and also his most chronic failure. "Business?" she said. "Yes." She nodded. Not a performance of acceptance, not loaded with anything pointed or wounded. Just a nod. She turned back to the garden. Damien drank his coffee. Left before 8. Celeste Arden lived in a penthouse in the Harlow district that Damien had purchased 2 years ago, under a shell company registered to a man who didn't exist. It was a 40-minute drive from the estate in light traffic. He made it in 26. His driver knew better than to comment on the speed. She met him at the elevator. She was already dressed, fitted black, hair loose, her stage presence fully assembled even though it wasn't yet 9 in the morning. Celeste was a woman who understood the weaponry of appearance in a way that Damien had always found compelling. She was beautiful in the aggressive, deliberate way of someone who had decided that beauty was a tool and was committed to maintaining it at full operational capacity at all times. She was also, Damien would later reflect, the greatest lapse in judgment he had ever made. But that reckoning was still some distance off. "Come in," she said. "I made coffee." "Tell me what's happening." She turned from the kitchen counter and looked at him with her dark eyes, and for just a moment he caught something in them that he didn't immediately identify. Later, he would understand it was calculation. In the moment, he read it as urgency. "I was followed last night," she said, "coming back from Vesper." "Followed by who?" "I don't know. Black SUV, no plates. Stayed 3 cars back all the way from Midtown. I had Costa check the garage cameras this morning." She set a tablet on the counter between them and turned it toward him. "They pulled in behind me, then left before Costa reached the footage timestamp." Damien looked at the image. The SUV was clean. No plates, like she said. The angle of the footage cut off the driver's window. "This isn't necessarily connected to you," he said. "Damien." Her voice sharpened. "I know when something's connected to me." He looked at her. "What aren't you telling me?" She was quiet for exactly long enough to make the silence mean something. "I got a call 3 days ago from someone using a number that traced back to a payphone in the warehouse district. They told me to watch my surroundings." She paused. "They also told me to watch yours." He set the tablet down. "Whose voice?" "Distorted. Couldn't tell gender." "What exactly did they say?" She met his eyes. "They said your wife was planning something." The kitchen was very quiet. Damien stood with his hands flat on the counter and looked at Celeste, and the first thing he noticed was that her expression was perfectly calibrated. The right amount of reluctance, the right amount of concern, the right mix of "I didn't want to tell you" and "you needed to know." It was a performance, though he didn't see it that way yet. He saw a woman delivering uncomfortable information at personal cost. He saw loyalty. He thought about Seraphine in the garden, the bare feet on the stone, the stillness. "Seraphine," he said, and even saying the name felt strange, felt like touching something he'd never quite gotten his hands around. "You're telling me my wife sent someone to follow you. I'm telling you what I was told. And I'm telling you what I saw." She moved around the counter, closer, her hand on his arm. I know she's your wife, Damien. I know what that means for you. But you asked me to come to you with anything that felt wrong, and this feels wrong. He didn't move her hand. He stood there with the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her and turned the thing over in his mind the way he always did. Methodically, with the part of his brain that didn't respond to emotion, that reduced everything to variables and risk. Seraphine. Quiet. Watchful. Never demanding anything. Never fighting about anything. In 4 years, she had not once raised her voice at him, had not once pushed back against his absences, his coldness, the open secret of his relationship with Celeste. She had inherited a strategic marriage, her family's name and connections tied to his syndicate's expansion interests, and she had inhabited it with the precise, measured grace of someone executing a long-term plan. He had never once asked himself what that plan was. I need you to be sure, he said. Not careful, sure. I'm sure enough to tell you. Celeste's fingers pressed slightly into his arm. That's all I can give you. He drove back to the estate without his driver. He found Seraphine in the library, which was where she spent most of her afternoons. Not reading. She was on the phone, standing near the window with her back to the door, speaking in a low, measured tone that he couldn't parse from the hallway. By the time he pushed the door open, she'd ended the call and was setting the phone face down on the windowsill with the unhurried ease of someone who had not been doing anything interesting. Who were you talking to? He said. She turned, read his face with those steady, unreadable eyes. My attorney, she said. I'm revising some of my personal trust instruments. Your attorney? He walked in. Didn't sit. Which attorney? A very small pause. Barely a breath's worth. Hartwell. You've met him. I've met him. He stood in the middle of the room. The library was hers more than any room in the house. The organization of it, the particular way she'd arranged the shelves, the reading lamp angled over the chair, the glass paperweight on the desk that she'd brought from wherever she'd come from. He'd never asked about that either. Tell me about your trust instruments. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not alarm, not even wariness, just a careful, precise attention. That's an odd thing to come home and ask about, she said. It's an odd morning. Is it? Not a question. She moved to the desk, settled into the chair behind it with the practiced ease of someone sitting in a position of habitual authority. He noticed this and didn't consciously register it. What happened this morning? You tell me. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window sideways, and in it her face was very composed and very still, and Damien had the sudden, unsettling sensation of standing at the edge of something enormous that he'd been treating as solid ground. Damien, she said, quietly. What has Celeste told you? The name landed like a rock in still water. He'd never heard her say it that directly before. Celeste was always your arrangement, or the situation, or simply not spoken of at all, which had been fine by him because it simplified things. Hearing Seraphine say Celeste's name with that particular lack of inflection, not wounded, not bitter, just precise, made the hair on the back of his neck rise. Celeste told me she was followed last night, he said. She received a call suggesting you were behind it. Seraphine looked at him. He waited. And you believe that, she said. I'm asking. You're not asking, she said very gently. You've already decided, I can tell by the way you're standing. He opened his mouth and she held up one hand, not sharply, not dramatically, just a small, flat gesture of pause. I'm not going to fight with you, she said. I never have, and I'm not going to begin now. But I want you to hear me clearly, Damien, because I'll only say this once. She stood. She was not a tall woman, but standing she had a quality of vertical precision that he found difficult to look away from. I did not have Celeste followed. I am not planning anything against her or anyone else. I have been nothing to this marriage but exactly what I agreed to be. Then who sent the SUV? I don't know. Her eyes didn't move from his. But I noticed you didn't ask Celeste that. He said nothing. You came home, Seraphine said, and you asked me. She let that sit. Then she picked up her phone from the windowsill and walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at him one final time. "Be careful who you trust with what," she said. "There are people in your life with interests that don't align with yours. I've always known that. I assumed you did too." She walked out. He stood in the library for a long time afterward. The next 72 hours moved with the particular grinding momentum of a bad decision gaining speed downhill. Celeste called him that evening with additional information, or what she framed as information. A name she said she'd gotten from one of her contacts, Marcus Eldon, an independent operator who supposedly ran surveillance work for clients who wanted deniability. Celeste said Eldon had been approached by someone using an intermediary with documented ties to the Vale family, Seraphine's birth family, the network of old money structures that had preceded the marriage. She sent him documents, photographs, time-stamped records. Damien's analysts verified them as authentic. His instincts told him something was wrong with the picture, but his instincts were currently losing the argument with 4 years of frustrated suspicion and Celeste's hands on his arm and the look in Seraphine's eyes when she'd said, "Be careful who you trust." Because who said that? Who walked out of an accusation that way, steady and precise, not fighting, not crying, just drawing a line and leaving? Either someone with nothing to hide, or someone who didn't need to hide anything because they were already several moves ahead. He told himself it was the second one. It wasn't the first time he'd told himself something because it was easier than looking at what he actually knew. He met with Renner on the second morning. The gate footage had produced nothing useful. Whoever delivered the letter had come through the garden's eastern wall on foot, a 12-foot climb that suggested training rather than improvisation. The letter's paper had traced to a commercial printer used by 40 different businesses within a 20-mile radius. The wax seal matched no known symbol in any database his people had access to. "Clean," Renner said, which was his way of saying whoever did this knew exactly what to avoid. "Too clean," Damien said. On the afternoon of the third day, Celeste called with one more thing. She said she'd found out about an account. A private account, she said, held under a blind trust in Seraphine's maiden name, containing assets she estimated, based on what she could access, at somewhere between $40 and $60 million. Celeste said she didn't know where the money came from. She said it worried her. She said she'd been afraid to tell him. Damien sat with that number for 3 minutes. 40 to 60 million. In a blind trust that his own financial team had no record of. He called his attorney, then his accountant, then a forensic financial investigator he'd used twice before in matters he preferred not to discuss in detail. He told all three the same thing. Find out what you can about trusts held in the name Seraphine Vale dating back before the marriage. Keep it quiet. Keep it fast. That same night, he told Seraphine he needed her to leave the estate for a few days. He framed it as security concerns. A threat against the household, nothing specific, but enough to warrant moving her to a safe location while his team addressed it. He had Renner escort her with 2 additional security personnel. He told himself it was protection. It wasn't protection. He stripped her security detail entirely at the city's safe house, rerouting Renner's team back to the estate. He told himself she would be fine for a few days. He told himself this was temporary, a precaution while he sorted through what he was being told. Seraphine got into the car that came for her. She carried 1 bag. She looked at Damien in the doorway of the estate with the same expression she always had. Measured, clear, giving nothing away. And she said nothing except, "All right, just that. All right." She didn't argue, didn't demand explanation, didn't ask where she was going or who was going with her, or why his jaw was set in that particular way that meant he'd already decided something without saying it out loud. She looked at him for exactly long enough, and then she picked up her bag, and she walked to the car, and she got in. Damien watched the car pull down the drive. He went back inside and called Celeste. "She's out of the estate," he said. Celeste's exhale on the other end was audible. "Good," she said. "That's good. I'll come over tonight." "Come tomorrow," he said. "I need to think." He hung up and stood in the foyer of his estate, surrounded by everything his name was attached to, everything he believed he'd built and controlled and commanded. He stood there with the silence of the house pressing in around him and the particular tight feeling behind his sternum that he was better at ignoring than anyone he'd ever met. He didn't know it yet. He had just removed the architect from the building. 12 hours after Seraphine's car left the estate gates, three things happened in rapid interlocking sequence. The first was a call to the Viscari Syndicate's primary financial coordinator, a man named Ortega, who had run the numbers for Damien's operations for 11 years. Ortega called at 2 a.m. to report that a series of accounts tied to the syndicate's primary holding structures had gone suddenly dark. Not closed, not emptied, dark, unreachable. As if someone had simply changed every password and access credential simultaneously. The second was a message to Damien's international liaison in the European corridor, a man named Strom, who managed relationships with their allied families across the Atlantic. Strom reported, in a voice that had the particular texture of controlled panic, that two of their primary allies had gone silent. Not hostile. Silent, as if they'd received instructions from somewhere else about who they were and were not taking calls from. The third was Renner, standing outside Damien's bedroom door at 3 a.m, telling him that the 6 captains Damien relied on for domestic operations, men who had answered to him for years, men he trusted the way you trust your own right hand, had simultaneously missed a mandatory check-in. All 6. No explanation, no contact. Damien sat at the edge of his bed in the dark. He had been in power a long time. He had navigated crises, betrayals, attempted coups, federal interference, and 2 near assassination attempts. He understood how power moved and what it looked like when it was being taken. He'd seen it happen to other men. He'd arranged it to happen to other men. He knew what this was. Someone was dismantling him. He reached for his phone. He was going to call Seraphine to check that she was safe at the secure location, not because he'd connected the pieces yet, not because he understood anything yet, but because something primal in his chest had switched on and was pointing at her name with the insistence of instinct rather than logic. The call went through. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, unhurried, as if it were noon on an ordinary day and not 3 a.m, with his entire operational infrastructure going dark around him. "Damien," she said, just his name. "Are you all right?" he said. A pause, very brief. "I'm fine," she said. "Is there something you need?" He sat with the phone against his ear in the dark room and listened to the particular quality of her voice, that careful, complete steadiness. And something shifted in his chest. Not understanding, not yet, but the first hairline crack in a certainty he'd been building for 4 years. "No," he said. "Go back to sleep." He ended the call. Renner was still at the door. "Get everyone in the war room," Damien said. "I want answers by morning." He got answers, just not the ones he was looking for. By dawn, the forensic investigators had traced the account lockouts to a series of administrative commands issued through encrypted channels that had one common signature, a routing architecture that his own team had never built and couldn't replicate. By mid-morning, 2 of the missing captains had resurfaced, and both of them, independently, without conferring, said the same incomprehensible thing. They'd received instructions, not from Damien, not from anyone in his known chain of command, from a source they described only as the standing authority. When Damien asked what that meant, both men went quiet, in the way men go quiet when they're afraid of the wrong person in the room. He was 3 steps from the answer. He just didn't know yet that the answer had bare feet and a gray silk wrap and had been standing in his garden every morning for 4 years, watching the groundskeeper trim hedges and saying very little and understanding absolutely everything. The letter on his desk came back to him. 12 words in clean black ink. "You don't know what you're sitting on. You never did." The day was barely begun, and it was already the last morning that anything would be the way Damien Viscari believed it was. The war room smelled like burnt coffee and nervous men. Damien stood at the head of the long table with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was how his people knew the situation had moved past the stage of appearances. Around him sat 7 of his most senior operatives, analysts, logistics coordinators, the 2 captains who had resurfaced, and Renner at the far end with a tablet he kept refreshing as if the numbers on it might change if he looked at them often enough. They hadn't changed. They kept saying the same thing, The same impossible, infuriating thing. "Walk me through it again," Damien said. "From the top, slowly." Ortega, his financial coordinator, was a compact man with reading glasses he only wore when he was too tired to care about looking vulnerable. He was wearing them now. He spread 3 printed pages across the table and pointed at the topmost column. "The primary accounts, the 4 holding structures that feed domestic operations, went dark at 11:47 last night. Not wiped, not transferred, suspended. Whatever system locked them used an administrative override protocol that our own architecture doesn't contain." He paused, the way men pause when they're about to say something that embarrasses them. "Meaning someone built a back door into our financial system that we didn't know existed. It's not a hack. It's a key." "Someone built a key," Damien said. "Someone built a key," Ortega confirmed, "before we built the lock." The room was quiet enough that Damien could hear the ventilation system running. He looked at Renner. "The captains," he said. "Start talking." The 2 men at the table, Vasek and Pruitt, both of whom had been with the syndicate for over a decade, exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, but said a great deal. Vasek spoke first. "We got a communication through a channel we'd never used before. Encrypted. No sender identification." "What channel?" "One we didn't set up." Vasek put his hands flat on the table, as if he needed to feel something solid. "It was already in our comms architecture. We found it when we looked for it, but we didn't put it there. Another key. Another door built before anyone knew the house existed." "The communication," Damien said. "What did it say?" Pruitt cleared his throat. He was a large man, physically imposing in the specific way of someone who had spent his career in rooms where physical size mattered. He looked diminished right now. "It said our operational directives were temporarily suspended pending realignment. It said we would receive further instruction within 48 hours. It said—" He stopped. "Pruitt. It said compliance was expected, not requested." He met Damien's eyes. "And it was signed." "Signed by who?" The 2 men looked at each other again. "It was signed," Vasek said carefully, "by the standing authority of the Shadow Council." Damien heard the words. He processed them the way you process a language you've heard before but never learned. The individual sounds familiar, the meaning completely inaccessible. He'd heard the name before. Once, maybe twice, in the kind of conversations that happened in the margins of serious meetings, the way old men sometimes reference things they didn't explain, things that existed in the background of the criminal world the way bedrock exists beneath city streets. You don't think about it. You build on top of it. You assume it holds. "What is the Shadow Council?" he said, not a question so much as a demand for the room to stop being strange. Nobody spoke for 5 seconds. Then Ortega, very quietly, "I've heard the name. In the context of the older families, the European structures. It's always been discussed as historical, as something that used to exist." "It's not historical," Renner said from the far end of the table. Damien looked at him. Renner had his eyes on the tablet. He turned it around and slid it down the table. On the screen was a document, old, scanned from what looked like physical paper, the edges slightly yellowed in reproduction. At the top, in a formal typeface that belonged to another era, Articles of Establishment, Shadow Council, 1947. Beneath that, a list of founding signatories representing 14 criminal organizations across 9 countries. At the bottom of the document, a single line of text that had been added in a different hand, more recent, the ink darker than the rest. Succession confirmed. Vale bloodline, 3rd generation. All assets and authorities transferred in full. The date on that line was 11 years ago. Damien stared at the name. Vale. Seraphine Vale. He pushed the tablet back without a word, stood up, walked to the window. The city was fully awake now, morning commuters and delivery trucks, the indifferent machinery of normal life operating below him at its usual pitch. He put one hand against the glass and let the cold of it move up through his palm. Behind him, nobody spoke. They were all waiting for him to process something that none of them fully understood either, and they knew better than to rush the process. "Get out," he said. "Damien?" Renner started. "Everyone out. Leave the documents." They filed out. Renner last, and Damien heard the specific quality of the door closing that meant Renner had pulled it shut with the careful, deliberate softness of a man trying not to add to the weight in the room. Damien stood at the window for a long time. Then he called Celeste. She answered immediately, which meant she'd been waiting. "What's happening? I've been hearing things." "Where did you get the documents on Seraphine's trust accounts?" he said. "The ones you sent me 3 days ago." A pause. Short, but real. "I told you. My contact." "Which contact? Specifically?" "Damien, why does that matter right now?" "Which contact, Celeste?" Another pause, longer this time, and in that pause Damien felt something he hadn't felt in years. The specific chill of realizing he'd been reading a room wrong for a very long time. "A financial analyst I've worked with before," she said. "He has access to certain private registry information. I can give you his name." "Give it to me." She gave him a name. He wrote it down. He ended the call and gave the name to Renner through the closed door and told him to find out everything about the man in the next 2 hours. Then he sat at the table alone with the scanned document in front of him and thought about the word succession. Thought about Seraphine at 17 dinners and 40 garden mornings and 100 conversations that had felt like negative space, all the things not said, all the stillness that he'd read as absence and that might have been something else entirely. Thought about her family, whom he'd met exactly 3 times before the marriage and who had impressed him primarily by their quality of controlled disengagement, that old money skill of being in a room without needing anything from it. He thought it was breeding, the particular blankness of inherited wealth. He was beginning to think it was something else. He was beginning to think it was the look of people who already owned the room. Renner came back in 90 minutes, which was faster than 2 hours and meant the information had been easy to find once you knew where to look. He stood across the table and kept his hands in his jacket pockets, which was Renner's tell when he was delivering something he didn't want to be the one to deliver. "The analyst Celeste named," he said. "Marcus Webb. He does exist. He does work in private financial registry access." A breath. "He also has a documented employment history with a logistics firm called Arvent Group. Arvent Group is a subsidiary of a holding company registered in the Caymans. The holding company's parent structure traces back through 4 layers of corporate insulation to an organization called Meridian Consulate." "And Meridian Consulate," Damien said, "is the primary operating front for a cartel out of Central and South America, known to federal task forces as the Heron Network." Renner pulled a single sheet from his jacket and laid it on the table. "The Heron Network has been flagged in intelligence reports for the past 18 months as actively targeting established criminal infrastructure in North America and Europe. Not for territory, for elimination." Damien looked at the sheet. "They're not trying to take over," he said. "They're trying to clear the board." "Yes." He looked up. "And Celeste's contact works for them." "Celeste's contact," Renner said, with the particular careful flatness of someone choosing each word like they're navigating around something sharp, "has had 3 documented meetings with Celeste Arden in the 4 months prior to her bringing you the documents on Mrs. Vescari's accounts." The room was very still. "Say the rest," Damien said. Renner looked at him steadily. "The documents were fabricated. Not well enough to fool a forensic accountant working on the original source data, but good enough to get past our initial verification because our verification was looking at secondary records, not primary source." He paused. "Whoever built those documents knew exactly how our verification process worked, knew what we'd check and what we'd miss." Damien sat back. The weight of what he was looking at arranged itself in his chest with the slow, grinding inevitability of tectonic movement. He'd sent his wife out of her own home based on manufactured evidence delivered by a woman who was working, knowingly or not, and increasingly he suspected knowingly, for an organization trying to destroy everything he'd built. He'd done their work for them. He'd removed the one person who might have been able to stop them. "Find Celeste," he said. His voice had gone very flat, which was what happened when the emotion exceeded what his face could carry. "Bring her to me, quietly." "And Mrs. Vescari?" Renner said. Damien looked at the succession document, the Vale bloodline. the ink darker than the rest. "Leave that to me," he said. What? He drove to the safe house himself. It was a brownstone in a quiet part of the city that the syndicate maintained for exactly this kind of situation: secure, anonymous, staffed by two of Renner's most reliable people. Or it had been staffed. When Damien arrived and let himself in through the rear entrance, he found both men at the kitchen table playing cards, which was what they did when there was nothing to secure. He stood in the doorway. "Where is she?" Both men looked up with the particular startled guilt of people caught being precisely as useless as suspected. The younger one started. "She left," the other one said. "This morning, early." Damien stared at them. "You let her leave." "She said she had an appointment. She was very—" The man seemed to realize midway through the sentence that no description of Seraphine's demeanor was going to improve his situation. He stopped. "She was very what?" Damien said. "Calm," the man said quietly. "She was very calm." He left them there and walked back out to the car and sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel and the engine off. The street outside was quiet. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck idling at the corner. Ordinary, irrelevant life conducting itself at its ordinary, irrelevant pace. Seraphine was gone. She'd walked out of the safe house that morning with one bag and left two armed men playing cards, and she'd done it without apparent difficulty because she was a woman who could exit a room in such a way that the room didn't quite register that she'd left until long after the door had closed. He called her number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice, recorded, crisp. "Leave a message." He didn't leave a message. He called again. Voicemail. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and drove back to the estate, and on the way back something happened that hadn't happened to Damien Viscari in a very long time. His hands, flat on the steering wheel, were not entirely steady. Celeste arrived at the estate at 2 in the afternoon, which was 40 minutes after Renner's people picked her up from the Harlow penthouse. She walked in through the front door like she'd been invited for lunch, which was a performance Damien might have admired at another time. She was wearing red, her hair was down. She looked, in the deliberate and assembled way she always looked, like a woman who was completely in control of the situation. She was not in control of the situation. Damien was in the sitting room. He didn't stand when she came in. He was in the chair nearest the fireplace with his ankle crossed over his knee and a glass of water on the side table, and he looked at her the way he looked at men he was deciding what to do with. She saw his face, and her performance recalibrated in an instant, the warmth in her expression cooling towards something more guarded, more alert. She was quick. He'd always given her that. She read rooms fast. "You're angry," she said. "Sit down, Celeste." She sat on the sofa across from him, crossed her legs, kept her spine straight, her hands in her lap. He watched her choose not to reach for her phone. "Tell me about Marcus Webb," he said. A very small muscle in her jaw tightened. If he hadn't been looking for it, he'd have missed it. "I already told you about Marcus." "Tell me again, and this time don't leave out the part about Meridian Consulate." The room went quiet in a different way than rooms usually go quiet. This was the silence of a particular kind of calculation, the kind that happens when someone realizes the story they've been telling has reached the edge of what the other person will accept. Celeste was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then she uncrossed her legs and leaned forward very slightly and looked at him with something that wasn't quite the expression he'd been seeing on her face for 2 years. This one was harder, more honest in its way. "You're smarter than I thought," she said. "Everyone makes that mistake," he said. "Start talking. I'm not going to insult you with a denial." She said it with a kind of flat practicality that felt, oddly, like the first genuinely real thing she'd said to him in months. "Yes, I know people connected to the network. Yes, the documents came through a source with ties to them. But Damien—" She paused, and something behind her eyes shifted towards something that looked almost like urgency. "The Shadow Council is not what you think it is. If what I've been told is correct, it controls more of your operation than you've ever been allowed to know. You've been managed, kept comfortable in a structure you thought you owned." "By who?" She looked at him steadily. "By your wife," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. I know, he said. She blinked. I know what Seraphine is, he said. I found out this morning. That's not the part I need you to explain. He leaned forward now, mirroring her posture. The part I need you to explain is why an organization that wants to destroy the Shadow Council needed you to destroy my marriage first. Celeste's composure held, but only barely. He could see the edge of it now, where it met something less controlled. Because she wouldn't come out in the open otherwise, Celeste said. She's not visible. She never has been. She operates through layers, through structures, through other people. The only way to get her to surface is to destabilize something she can't afford to lose from the shadows. She paused. They thought that was you. They used you to strip away her cover. They used me, Celeste said with a sharpness that might have been genuine resentment, to make you do it. The silence that followed was long and had several different textures. Damien stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the grounds of the estate were immaculate in the afternoon light, the hedge lines exact, the stone paths clear. Everything in its right place. Everything exactly as it appeared. Where is she? He said. Not to Celeste, to the window, to the estate that he suddenly, viscerally understood in a completely different way than he had this morning. I don't know, Celeste said. That's the truth. No one on my end knows. She went dark the moment she left your safe house, and a woman like that... A pause. A woman like that goes dark on purpose. He turned around. You're going to help me find her, he said. Celeste looked at him with something that might have been surprise and might have been the early stages of fear. Why would I do that? Because the network sent you to use me to expose her, and you succeeded. And now she knows it, and the only people who are going to be less safe than me in the next 48 hours are the people the network sent to do the job. He held her gaze. You're one of those people. He watched that land, watched her process it. You're saying I need your protection, she said. I'm saying you need her not to know how much of this was you. He moved toward the door. So you're going to help me reach her before the network does, and you're going to be very honest for what I suspect is the first time in our entire relationship about everything you know. He stopped in the doorway and looked back. Celeste was sitting very still on the sofa. The hardness in her expression had given way to something more complicated. Not quite fear, not quite calculation, but the particular look of a person who has run one too many simultaneous games and is only now counting how many of them are pointing back at her. I'll need to make a call, she said. You'll make it in front of me, he said. He left her in the sitting room with one of Renner's men at the door, and went upstairs and stood in the hallway outside the library for a long time. The door closed, the room on the other side of it empty. He put his hand flat on the door. The silence of the room came back through it like pressure. He'd stood in the garden with her this morning. No, not this morning. 3 mornings ago now. 4 years of mornings. The bare feet on the flagstone, the coffee cup. The particular quality of her attention, which he had never once correctly identified because he'd never once been looking for the right thing. He'd been looking for a wife, a decorative spouse, like the world said she was, like he'd been comfortable assuming she was, a woman in the margins of his life. He had never once looked at the margins and asked who drew them. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. An unknown number. The text was 3 words. Stop looking, Damien. He stared at the screen. Another buzz. Same number. I already know. He was still holding the phone when Renner appeared at the end of the hallway, moving fast, with the expression he wore when something had happened that couldn't wait. The Heron Network, Renner said. They just activated. Our sources are reporting movement, significant movement, on 4 separate fronts simultaneously. They're not waiting. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at Damien with eyes that had the particular quality of a man who is very good at his job and is currently unsure his job is going to be enough. They're moving tonight. Damien looked at the phone in his hand, at the 3 words on the screen. He looked at Renner. Call everyone in, he said. Every captain, every operator, everyone with a gun and a reason to use it. He pocketed the phone. And get me a line into whatever the Shadow Council uses for communications, because I don't care what it takes. I need to reach my wife before midnight, or by morning there won't be enough left of either of our operations to argue about." Renner held his gaze for 1 second. Then he turned and moved, fast and purposeful, back down the hallway, already talking into his earpiece. Damien stood alone in the corridor with his hand still raised where it had been pressed against the library door. The Heron network was moving. Seraphine was somewhere in the city, dark, unreachable, and almost certainly already 7 steps ahead of everything happening around her. And somewhere in his penthouse across town, Celeste Arden was on a phone she wasn't supposed to be using, talking to people she wasn't supposed to still be talking to, making one final move that none of them, not Damien, not the network, not even the carefully constructed machinery of Seraphine's invisible empire, had accounted for. The message on his phone said, "I already know," and Damien was still standing in the hallway turning that over when Renner's voice came back through the door at the far end, sharper now, with the compressed urgency of someone receiving information faster than they could process it. Damien walked toward the sound. The war room had filled back up in the time he'd spent in the corridor. 8 men now, some standing, some hunched over laptops, all of them with the particular tight-shouldered posture of people who understood that the margin between manageable and catastrophic had just gotten very thin. The room smelled like sweat and electronics, and the specific fear that comes not from physical danger, but from the sensation of control evaporating. Renner met him at the door. "4 fronts," he said, holding up the tablet with a city map marked in red. "The warehouse district, our primary storage for the eastern corridor, the Aldgate processing facility, the security post at the Verano building, and," he paused 1 beat, "the Hartwell offices." Damien looked at the map. Hartwell. Seraphine's attorney. The name dropped into the room and sat there. Damien looked at the 4 red marks. They were not random, they were not opportunistic, they were surgical. 4 points that, taken together, represented the nervous system of his operation's daily function. Storage, processing, security coordination, and legal structure. Hit all 4 simultaneously, and you didn't just disrupt the syndicate. You paralyzed it. You left it blind and immobile while you did whatever you'd actually come to do. "They're not after the locations," Damien said. "They're creating noise." Renner looked at him. 4 simultaneous strikes means 4 simultaneous response deployments. Every resource we have moves outward, toward the perimeter. He traced the red marks with 1 finger, then pulled it to the center of the map where nothing was marked. And the center opens up. "What's at the center?" Damien looked at the map for 3 seconds. Then he said the address of the estate. The room went very quiet. "Pull everyone back," Damien said. All 4 locations. Pull the response teams back now. Skeleton crews only. Don't leave the locations empty, but don't send me 20 men to guard a warehouse. If we pull back and they're actually hitting those locations, then we lose some product and some infrastructure and we rebuild it." Damien looked at Renner directly. "If we empty the estate and they're actually coming here, we lose everything." A pause. "Including Celeste." Renner's expression shifted by a fraction. Not surprise exactly. More like the acknowledgement of a shift in priority structure that he hadn't been expecting. "You're protecting her." "I'm using her," Damien said. "There's a difference. She's the only person in this building who has direct operational contact with the network. I need her alive and in my possession until I understand what they're actually moving toward." He turned from the map. "Get me eyes on all 4 locations through remote feeds, and get me the Shadow Council communications architecture, whatever channel the captains received instructions through. I want in." "We don't have credentials for that channel." "Then find someone who does." He walked toward the door. "Vasek, Pruitt." One of them received those instructions directly. Their devices had access. Pull the access logs. He left the war room and walked to the sitting room and opened the door without knocking. Celeste was on the sofa where he'd left her, but the posture had changed. She was leaning forward now with her elbows on her knees and her phone face down on the cushion beside her. And when she looked up at him, her expression had shed its last layer of performance. What was underneath was harder and more frightened than anything he'd seen on her face before, and it was— he registered this with a cold, clinical detachment, more honest than anything she'd shown him in 2 years. "The network is moving tonight," he said. 4 targets simultaneously. I know, she said. I heard. The decoy targets. She held his gaze. I know. Tell me the real target. She looked at him for a long moment. Her right hand moved toward the phone beside her and then stopped, as if she'd caught herself in the action and decided against it. The stillness of that small aborted gesture told him more than anything she'd said in the last hour. Celeste. His voice was flat as pavement. If you make one more call to your network contact before you tell me what I'm asking, I will have you removed from this building and left outside it, and whatever protection you currently have by being in my sitting room will be gone. Do you understand me? She understood him. He could see it in the way her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. There's a summit, she said, scheduled for 3 days from now. The Eastern families, 12 Dawn families across the coast. It was called by the Shadow Council. He was very still. I wasn't told about a summit. No, she said. You weren't. The thing in his chest that had been tightening since the morning tightened another degree. It's a trap. It's an opportunity, Celeste said, for the network. If the Shadow Council is calling a summit of every major family in the Eastern Territory, then every significant power in the criminal structure of the Eastern Seaboard will be in one location at one time. She paused. That's not a coincidence. That's a target. Who called the summit? She met his eyes. It was called in the name of the standing authority. Seraphine. It had been called by Seraphine. He turned away from Celeste and moved to the window and stood there with one hand against the frame, looking at the grounds in the fading afternoon light. The gardener had gone home. The grounds were empty and immaculate and perfectly, fraudulently peaceful. Seraphine had called a summit. Every family, every significant power, one location, and the network intended to be there. He pulled out his phone, called her number again. This time it didn't even ring, straight to voicemail, her voice. Leave a message. I know about the summit, he said. I know about all of it. Call me back, please. He said the last word with the effort of a man deploying a vocabulary that had atrophied from disuse. He ended the call. He stood there for another 3 seconds, then his phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. Same unknown number as before. Come to the Caldwell building, 14th floor. Come alone. Now. He stared at the screen. Then he put the phone in his jacket, turned to the door, and said to the guard outside, Nobody leaves this room. Oh. The Caldwell building was a commercial tower in the financial district that had been partially decommissioned 2 years ago during a development dispute. The lower floors were occupied by a handful of holdover tenants. The upper floors were empty. The 14th floor had been empty for 18 months. Damien knew the building. His syndicate owned the development company that had been fighting the dispute. He knew every access point, every camera blind spot, every elevator sequence. He went in through the parking structure, took the service stairs, and came out on 14 through the fire door with his hand near the weapon at his back and his eyes moving before he stepped fully into the corridor. The floor was empty in the way of spaces that have been emptied deliberately rather than abandoned. No construction debris, no leftover furniture, no dust on the floor that had accumulated naturally. Someone had been here recently. Someone had cleaned it. He moved down the corridor toward the southeast corner, where the exterior windows would give a view of 3 city blocks in 2 directions. The light was failing outside, the city shifting from afternoon gold to early evening gray. He found her in the corner office. Seraphine was standing at the window with her back to him, looking out at the city. She'd changed from the gray silk of this morning. She was wearing something dark now, a structured jacket over a high-necked top. Her hair still pulled back, one hand at her side, the other holding her phone loosely, the screen dark. She didn't turn when he came in. "Close the door," she said. He closed it. He didn't move any farther into the room because some instinct that had been recalibrating all day was telling him to be careful about the distance between them, that this was a different kind of conversation than any they'd had before and required a different geometry. "How long have you been here?" he said. "Long enough." She turned now, slowly, and he looked at her face in the gray window light and found it different than he remembered. Not harder. He wouldn't have described it as harder. More present. As if the quality of careful concealment that had been her primary feature for 4 years had shifted, revealing something underneath that had been there the entire time, and that he simply hadn't had the capacity to see. She looked at him with those clear, steady eyes, and she said, "Sit down, Damien." "I'd rather stand." "I know." The ghost of something crossed her expression. "Sit down anyway." There was a chair against the wall. He sat in it, not because she'd told him to, but because his body was making a practical argument for it that had something to do with the 18-hour deficit of food and sleep. He sat, and he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the silence lasted exactly long enough to establish that they were both done pretending the usual rules applied. "The summit," he said. "Tell me what you're doing." "Exactly what it looks like," she said. "You're gathering every family in the Eastern Territory in one building at one time, and the network knows about it, and they're planning to use it." "Yes." He waited for more. She let him wait. "Seraphine." His voice came out differently than he'd intended. Not flat, not commanding, but carrying something raw and tired that he hadn't planned to reveal. "Tell me you have a plan that doesn't end with every major criminal family on the East Coast in a body bag." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, very slightly, in the direction of something that might have been sadness if she'd permitted it to fully arrive. She didn't. It passed through and was gone. "Let me ask you something first," she said. "When you stripped my security and sent me out of our home, whose safety were you protecting?" He didn't answer. "When you believe fabricated documents over 4 years of living with me, what did you think you knew about me that made that reasonable?" "Seraphine, I'm not asking to wound you," she said, and her voice was so genuinely without cruelty that it was worse than if she'd meant to hurt him. "I'm asking because the answer matters for what I'm about to tell you." She moved from the window and sat in the chair across from him, close enough that he could see the tiredness around her eyes that she was containing through sheer structural discipline. "What did you think I was?" He looked at her face. "I thought you were someone I didn't know well enough to understand," he said. "I told myself that was your fault, that you were closed off, difficult to reach." He paused. "I think I knew, somewhere, that I'd never really tried." She looked at him without expression. Then she looked at her hands briefly and looked back up. "The Shadow Council has existed for 78 years, she said. "My family built it. 3 generations of women who understood that visible power is borrowed power, so it can be taken. Invisible power is structural. It holds." She said it the way someone states a mathematical principle they've understood since childhood, without drama, without pride, just fact. "I inherited authority at 22. I've been managing the council's interests since before I met you." A pause. "Your family was under council protection before you were born. Your father knew this. He chose not to tell you." Damien felt the floor of his understanding shift. "My father. He made a decision when you were 17 that he believed was protective. He decided you would be safer not knowing, safer, and more useful as a visible figurehead who genuinely believed he was in charge." She held his gaze without flinching. "He wasn't wrong, from a strategic standpoint. A man who believes he holds power behaves very differently from a man who knows he's a proxy. The performance was more convincing because you believed it." The room was completely silent. Damien sat with what she'd said and felt it rearrange everything. Every decision his father had made, every conversation, every moment of authority the old man had passed to him like an inheritance. Not an inheritance, a costume, carefully maintained, carefully handed down. "He knew," Damien said, "when he died. He knew what you were. He asked me to take care of you," she said simply, "in the way that was possible, given the structure." He closed his eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. She was still there, watching him with that careful, complete attention. "The network," he said. "How long have they been moving against the council?" 18 months of active organization, longer in conception." She stood, moved back to the window. "They're not conventional. They don't want territory or assets. They want the architecture of criminal governance itself to collapse. If the council falls, every family under its structure loses the legal insulation, the financial frameworks, the political protection that the council has built over decades. They'd be exposed, individually, simultaneously, with no coordination mechanism to respond." Federal prosecution on a scale that would end organized crime in this territory for a generation. She paused. That's the objective. Not money. Destruction. Using the summit as the trigger point. They think so. He looked at her. What do you mean they think so? She turned from the window and looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has just arrived at the part of the conversation they've been navigating toward from the beginning. The summit is real, she said. Every family will be there. The network will move against it. They will bring significant force, enough to overwhelm the security visible to their intelligence network. They've been watching the preparations for weeks. They know what they're walking into. She paused. They don't know what they're walking into, she said. He stared at her. You're going to let them come. I'm going to let them come, she confirmed, into a location I've been preparing for 6 months, with an operational security architecture they have no awareness of, against a target that will behave exactly as they expect right up until the moment it doesn't. She held his gaze. The summit is the trap, but they think we're the ones in it. The magnitude of it settled over him slowly, the way cold water settles. First the surface, then deeper, until it's everywhere at once. She'd known about the network for 18 months. She'd watched them build their plan. She'd let them build it. She'd let them get close enough to be confident, close enough to commit fully, close enough to bring everything they had. And then she'd sent herself out of the estate in a car with one bag and left 2 men playing cards. And she'd gone dark, and she'd been here. Not hiding, not running, arranging. Celeste, he said. She's been feeding them information about our preparations. Yes. She told them about security deployments, staffing, the layout. Everything she told them is accurate, Seraphine said. She told them what she saw because what she saw is what I needed them to see. She looked at him with something that was very close to patience but had too much steel in it to be soft. Celeste has been my instrument since before she was yours, Damien. Not consciously. She doesn't know. She was chosen because she was ambitious, and because she would inevitably end up in your orbit, and because she could be positioned over time to be exactly who the network would approach when they needed an asset close to you. A beat. She's not their spy. She's mine. She just doesn't know it yet. The room tilted. He sat very still and looked at his wife and felt the full-dimensional scale of what he'd been living inside. Not a marriage, not a crime organization, not a power structure. An architecture. Built around him, through him, using him as a load-bearing element that didn't know it was part of the structure. The documents she brought me, he said. About your accounts. Were fabricated by me, Seraphine said. Not by the network's analyst. By my people, in a format I knew would pass your verification process. I gave them to Webb, knowing he'd pass them to Celeste. Celeste brought them to you. She paused. I needed you to remove me from the estate. He heard this, and the hearing of it took longer than usual. I needed to not be in the estate, she said. I needed the network to see me be removed. To see you take the action visibly, obviously, in a way their surveillance would register. A wife expelled by a suspicious husband is vulnerable. A wife expelled by a suspicious husband is a possible asset. A wife expelled by a suspicious husband is something the network might approach. Her voice was completely level. They reached out to me 43 hours after I left. Damien stood up. He didn't make a decision to stand up. His body did it on its own, the way bodies sometimes take action ahead of the mind when the mind is occupied with something that requires its full attention. They approached you, he said, through an intermediary, a woman named Cade. I've been in contact with their operational leadership for 36 hours. She looked at him without apology, without performance. They believe I'm a resource, a woman with access to Shadow Council intelligence who has been removed from her husband's protection and has reason to be cooperative. She tilted her head slightly. They're bringing me to the summit. They're bringing you to... He stopped. The blood in his ears was audible. Seraphine, if they know what you are, they don't know what I am, she said. They think they know what I was. A decorative wife, now discarded, now angry, now useful. They've been reading the script I've been writing for months. The corner of her mouth moved by the smallest fraction. They're very confident. And if something goes wrong... She looked at him. Something already went wrong, she said. You weren't supposed to find out about any of this. You were supposed to stay in the estate, manage the decoy threats tonight, and arrive at the summit in 3 days not knowing anything about the network's involvement. She paused. You were supposed to be the convincing performance one last time. He felt the sentence go in, not with anger. That would come later, maybe. Right now it landed with the clean precision of something perfectly true, and the truth of it was that he understood it, not just intellectually, but in the gut, where understanding lives when it's real rather than performed. He had been the performance, for 4 years and for most of his adult life before that. And she'd just told him that to his face with neither cruelty nor apology, just the flat, complete honesty of a person who has decided that the time for protective fiction has ended. But you called me here, he said. Yes. Why? She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it had always been, measured, controlled, giving almost nothing away. But in the almost, there was something, a thin edge of something that in any other person he would have called vulnerability, and in Seraphine he couldn't name. Because the network made a move I didn't anticipate, she said. Tonight's 4 targets, I knew about 3 of them. I planned for 3 of them. She reached into her jacket and drew out a folded document. The 4th target is not on my operational grid. Hartwell's offices. Hartwell has records that I did not move, that I believed were secure under a protection structure that the network should not have been able to identify or access. She held out the document. He took it. It was a list of names. 26 names with associated shell company registrations, account numbers, and physical addresses. He scanned it and understood within seconds what he was looking at. The silent partners. The human beings behind the financial structures, the legal instruments, the real estate holdings. The people who did not appear in any public record in any country and who constituted the living infrastructure of the Shadow Council's operational capacity. 26 people who did not officially exist. If the network gets those files from Hartwell, he said, every name on that list becomes a target, she said, and every structure they underwrite becomes exposed, not gradually, immediately, in one night. She looked at him. The summit plan falls apart because the council's operating capacity collapses before anyone reaches the room. He looked at the list. How did they find out about Hartwell? She was quiet for exactly 1 second, which was 1 second more than she'd been quiet before any previous answer. Someone told them, she said. He looked up. Her eyes met his. And in them, beneath the steel, beneath the architecture, beneath every layer of the most controlled and capable person he had ever known, he saw something that looked like the first genuine fracture. Not fear, not helplessness. The specific bone-deep expression of someone who has just discovered that the betrayal came from somewhere they had believed was impossible. Someone inside the council, he said. Someone I trusted, she said. Someone I have trusted for a very long time. She paused. Someone who has had access to every layer of the operation since before I inherited it. The silence in the room changed again. It had new weight. Damien looked at the list in his hands, looked at the woman across from him, the woman who had run everything, managed everything, built a trap sophisticated enough to catch an international criminal network, maintained a marriage as cover while operating the most powerful criminal governance structure in the hemisphere. And he watched her stand at the window of an empty building in a city that was moving toward night, and hold, with great effort, the look of a person whose architecture has just developed an unforeseen crack. You don't know who it is, he said. Not yet, she said, but they're in the council. Or adjacent to it, she said. Close enough to know about Hartwell, close enough to have passed the information. She turned back to the window. Which means they'll be at the summit. Damien set the document down on the windowsill beside her and stood next to her and looked out at the city in the failing light, at the thousands of windows switching on one by one as the dark came in, and he said, What do you need from me? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet and more unguarded than he'd ever heard it. I need to get to Hartwell's offices before the network's people do. That requires resources I've isolated from my primary operation to avoid alerting whoever is feeding them information. She paused. Resources I don't currently have direct access to. You need my people. I need people that nobody inside the council knows about, she said, which means I need people from outside it. He looked at her profile in the window's gray light. And you're asking me. She turned her head and looked at him, and for one moment the architecture was completely still, and what was underneath it was something complicated and tired and entirely human. Yes, she said. I'm asking you. He pulled out his phone and called Renner, and before Renner could speak, he said, Hartwell's offices. Every available body. Right now. He paused. And Renner, if anyone inside our operation has had contact with an outside network in the last 48 hours that I don't know about, I need to know before we get there. He ended the call and pocketed the phone and looked at Seraphine and said, Let's go. She picked up her jacket from the chair and put it on with the same practiced efficiency she applied to everything, and she moved toward the door, and Damien fell in beside her, and in the corridor with its failing light and its empty rooms, they moved together toward the stairwell, and it was the first time in 4 years that he'd walked in the same direction as his wife, and had any real understanding of where they were both going. They were halfway down the second flight when his phone buzzed. Renner. He answered. We have a problem, Renner said, and his voice had the quality of someone who has just seen something they can't unsee. Hartwell's office. Our people arrived 2 minutes ago. The network's people were already there. A pause. They weren't there for the files. Damien stopped on the landing. Seraphine stopped beside him. Renner, he said, what were they there for? There was a man in the office, Renner said. Older. They're saying he'd been there a while, waiting. The network people took him when they left. Another pause, shorter, with something terrible packed into it. His name is Hartwell, but that's not... Damien, the man had a card in his pocket with a council seal on it. The real one. Our people recognized it from the captain's communications. Damien looked at Seraphine. He wasn't taken, Renner said. He walked out with them. Voluntarily. Seraphine had gone completely still beside him. The color in her face had shifted by 1 degree, the way things shift when the body receives information before the mind has processed it. She was looking at the phone in Damien's hand with an expression he had never seen on her face before. The man who had served as the Shadow Council's primary legal architect for 30 years. The man who had processed the succession that transferred everything to Seraphine's name. The man who had held every document, every trust instrument, every piece of the infrastructure that made the invisible empire real. Hartwell had been the traitor, and he had just walked into the hands of the network, with everything. Seraphine moved first. She was already on the stairs before Damien had fully processed what Renner had said, her hand on the railing and her feet finding each step without looking, the way people move when their body has made a decision that the mind is still catching up to. Damien followed. Behind them, the empty building fell away, floor by floor, and the stairwell echoed with the sound of their descent. Her steps quick and precise, his heavier, both of them saying nothing because there was nothing to say. Yet that was more useful than moving. They hit the parking structure at a run. His car. She got in the passenger side without being asked, which told him she'd either planned for this or had stopped caring about the protocol of their usual distance. He pulled out of the structure hard, tires finding the wet pavement of the street with a sound like tearing paper. How much did Hartwell have access to? He said. Not a question in the normal sense. Everything I just told you about. Her voice was controlled but stripped of its usual finish, the way metal looks when the paint comes off. Trust instruments, succession documentation, the account structures underlying council operations, the physical addresses of 11 council properties that aren't registered to any traceable entity. She paused. And the summit location. He took the corner fast. The city blurred in the windows. They'll cancel the summit. No, she said. He glanced at her. Her profile in the passing streetlights was rigid, carved. If they cancel the summit after Hartwell walks out with the network, every family reads it as the council losing control, she said. The summit happens. It has to happen. It's the only thing that holds the structure together long enough to... She stopped. Started again. It has to happen. Then they know where it is. They know the location, the timing. They know what Hartwell knows. She turned to look at him for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. Hartwell doesn't know everything. The way she said it told him she meant it literally. He drove and she sat beside him, and the city moved around them at speed, and he thought about the architecture she'd described. Layers upon layers, each one containing only what the person occupying it needed to know. A structure built specifically against the possibility of exactly what had just happened. The question was how many layers Hartwell had penetrated, how deep the trust had gone, how much of what Seraphine believed was secure was actually exposed. His phone buzzed. Renner again. He answered on speaker. The network crew that took Hartwell. We tracked them 4 blocks east of the Hartwell offices and lost them in the warehouse district, Renner said. 6 vehicles. Professional convoy, clean lane discipline. They knew the camera grid. A pause. They've got a location we haven't identified. Keep looking. Damien glanced at Seraphine. What else? Celeste, Renner said. She's gone. The car was silent for 1 second. What do you mean gone? The guard on the sitting room door found the room empty 11 minutes ago. There's a window. She went out through it. Another pause. 3rd floor window, Damien. She dropped 12 feet onto the garden portico. Seraphine made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He looked at her. Her jaw was tight. Celeste just became a liability, she said, quietly, to herself as much as to him. She's running to the network, Damien said, or she's running from them. Seraphine's eyes moved to the windshield. She heard enough in that building to understand that her position is more complicated than she thought. A woman like Celeste runs calculations continuously. She's running one right now. A beat. The question is which answer she arrives at. And if she goes to them, she doesn't know enough to materially help them. She knows what she was allowed to see. A pause. But she knows the summit is in 3 days. She knows you're aware of the network, and she knows your people are mobilizing tonight. Seraphine's hands were folded in her lap with a tension she was visibly managing. That's enough to accelerate their timeline. He turned onto the boulevard that would take them toward the financial district, where 3 of Renner's secondary teams were currently converging on the Hartwell offices to manage a scene that was already cold. They needed something warm. They needed Hartwell. Do you know where they'd take him? Damien said. I know where I'd take him, she said. If I were running the operation and I'd just acquired a primary council intelligence source, I'd move him out of the city tonight. Not to a fixed location they've used before, see? Somewhere clean, somewhere I controlled completely, somewhere with enough time and privacy to extract everything he has before anyone organized a response. She paused. The warehouse district is the wrong direction for that. The warehouse district is where you go if you want to transit, not if you want to hold. Transit to where? North, she said. There's a port facility 60 miles up the coast. The network has used it twice in the past year for movement of high-value assets. We identified it through shipping manifests, but never had reason to act on it. She looked at him. If they're putting Hartwell on a boat, he's gone. Once he's offshore, I can't reach him. And he will tell them everything he has within 24 hours of leaving territorial waters. Damien took the next turn and pointed the car north. Seraphine looked at him. I have 9 people within range of that port, he said. Renner can have 12 more there within 40 minutes. He reached for the phone. It's not going to be clean. No, she said. It isn't. They drove in a silence that was different from every other silence they'd shared. Not empty, not strategic, not the managed distance of a marriage that had been a cover story. This was the silence of 2 people in a moving vehicle heading toward something violent and uncertain, with 40 minutes to sit in it and no useful fiction left to fill the space. Damien drove. Seraphine sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead, and after about 15 minutes she said without looking at him, I'm sorry. He didn't say anything immediately. Not for what I built, she said, or for how I built it, but for what I didn't tell you. There were moments when She stopped, started again, and he could hear the precision it required, the careful word-by-word construction of someone who rarely allowed themselves to be imprecise about anything, including their own feelings. I told myself you were safer not knowing. I told myself the same thing my father told himself when he kept it from your father. That protection is a reason. A pause. I don't think it was only that. He kept his eyes on the road. What else was it? I didn't know what you'd do with it, she said, with knowing. With me. Her voice was level, but the levelness was effortful in a way he could hear now that he'd learned to listen for it. You were very good at the visible world, at being exactly what the syndicate needed you to be. I didn't know if you'd want to exist in the other one. The invisible one. Yes. He thought about that. Thought about the last 24 hours, about the war room and the documents and the letter with 12 words and the sensation repeated throughout the day of floors giving way beneath what he'd believed was solid ground. You could have asked, he said. She looked at him for the first time in 15 minutes. Yes, she said. I could have. He didn't say anything else. She didn't either. Outside, the city was thinning at the edges, the dense commercial grid giving way to wider roads and darker margins, and the lights in the rear view were fewer and further between. His phone connected to Renner. 12 minutes out from the port facility, Renner said. Our advance team is in position on the perimeter. 6 vehicles identified inside the fence line. Same configuration as the convoy that picked up Hartwell. They're there. Hartwell? Can't confirm visual yet. Building 2, the covered dock structure, is showing heat signatures. Multiple. Damien looked at Seraphine. She gave a single nod. We go in through the east approach, Damien told Renner. I want the boat disabled before anyone reaches it. Whatever's docked there, I want it not moving. A pause. And Renner, I want Hartwell alive. Whatever else happens. Understood. He ended the call. The port lights were visible now, a low smear of industrial amber on the horizon against the dark. Seraphine reached into her jacket and produced a handgun. Compact, matte black, the kind of weapon chosen for concealment rather than intimidation. She checked the magazine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times, which was, he realized, another thing he had never known about her. He didn't comment on it. She didn't explain it. Bachan. The east approach was a service road running behind the port's secondary fence line, poorly lit, with a gap in the camera coverage that Renner's advance team had already identified. Damien killed the headlights 200 meters out and rolled the last stretch on navigation and memory, the gravel under the tires a low, continuous sound like something being decided. They stopped behind a loading structure. 2 of Renner's people materialized from the dark on the driver's side. Men he recognized, men who didn't need to be told twice about anything. He got out. Seraphine got out. One of the men looked at her, and then looked at Damien, and Damien said nothing, and the man said nothing either, and they moved. The covered dock was 60 meters across open ground. Between their position and the building, 2 guards on a walking pattern, a fence gate secured with a chain rather than an electronic lock, and a forklift sitting idle that provided partial concealment for about 20 meters of the crossing. Renner's advance team had already mapped the guard timing. The window was 40 seconds. They took it. The inside of the dock structure smelled like salt water and machine oil and the cold that comes off open water even when you can't see it. The boat, a medium-range vessel, commercial grade, the kind that could cross to international waters without drawing attention, was moored at the far end, its running lights off, its engine making the low preparatory sound of something about to start. They had less time than Damien had calculated. He saw Hartwell immediately. The man was seated on a crate near the boat's gangway, wrists zip-tied in front of him, wearing his office clothes, gray suit, no tie, reading glasses still hanging from the breast pocket. He was surrounded by 4 network operators who had the body language of men who'd done this before and weren't anxious about it. Near the gangway itself, a 5th man stood talking into a phone, his back partially to the dock, his posture projecting the particular ease of command. He was the one in charge. Damien marked him immediately. Renner's voice in his earpiece. 8 more in the outer structure. We have eyes on them. Your signal. Damien looked at Seraphine beside him. She was looking at Hartwell, looking at the old man on the crate in his gray suit and his reading glasses, and her expression was, he watched it because he was learning to watch. The expression of someone who has been betrayed by something they loved, processed that betrayal completely in the space of 40 minutes, and arrived at the other side of it in a place that is colder and more functional than grief, but carries grief's full weight underneath. She looked away from Hartwell and looked at Damien and gave him one nod. He pressed the signal. The dock exploded into noise. Renner's people came through 3 entry points simultaneously: the personnel door at the north end, the cargo gate to the east, and through the ceiling via a service walkway that 2 operators had reached in the prior 15 minutes. The network's outer guards went down fast and loud, the sound of it rolling through the dock structure like pressure. The 4 men around Hartwell went for their weapons. Damien was already moving. He covered the distance to the nearest one in 4 seconds and hit him at the shoulder. And the momentum took them both sideways into the crate stack, metal corners, and the man's elbow in his ribs, and his own hand finding the man's gun wrist and bending it wrong. The gun skittered. He left it and turned. To his right, Seraphine had moved with a directness and economy of motion that his mind registered as trained. Not improvised, not desperate, trained, putting herself between Hartwell and the second operator with the handgun raised, and the man reading in her stance exactly what she intended, which was enough, because he stopped. "Down," she said. One word. The man went down. The third and fourth operators were already engaged with Renner's people. The dock was full of sound. Boots on concrete, shouted commands, something heavy falling. The boat's engine noise increased a pitch, and Damien looked at the gangway, and the man who'd been standing there was gone. "The boat," he said. Renner, in his ear, "We've got the engine room. He's not going anywhere." But the man with the phone was somewhere in the dock, and Damien had lost him in the 30 seconds of contact, and losing the man in charge in an enclosed space was the kind of mistake that had consequences. He turned in a full circle, reading the dock. Crate stacks, forklift, the moored vessel, the personnel door now open and 2 of Renner's people coming through with a third man between them. To the left, near the water's edge where the dock boards ran right to the black surface of the harbor, something moved. The network commander, moving toward a secondary exit, a narrow door set in the seawall, the kind that opened onto an external dock ladder. Damien went after him. The seawall door was heavy, industrial, and the man got through it ahead of him by 3 seconds. When Damien came through it, the cold air off the water hit him like a flat hand, and the man was on the external dock ladder, descending toward a rigid inflatable tied to a cleat at the waterline, moving fast. Damien went over the railing. He dropped 8 feet onto the lower dock board, and his knees registered it, and he kept moving, reaching the ladder as the man hit the bottom, and the gap between them was 4 feet, and he covered it in 2 seconds and got a hand on the man's collar, and they went down together onto the dock board above the water. The man was strong, and had the particular focused violence of someone who had decided that capture was not an acceptable outcome. He got an elbow into Damien's face, not clean, but enough to split the skin at the cheekbone and send white across his vision for a second and a half. Damien tasted blood. He got his arm around the man's neck and put his weight into it, and the man bucked and clawed at the arm, and Damien held it, while the water moved black and cold beneath them and the sounds from inside the dock came muffled through the seawall. The man went still. Damien held the choke for 3 more seconds to be sure. Then he sat back on the dock board with the harbor at his back and the cold in his teeth and his cheek running warm, and put his hand on the man's jacket to check for the phone. Found it. He stood up. When he came back through the seawall door, the dock was controlled. Renner's people had the remaining network operators flex-cuffed and positioned against the crate stacks. Hartwell was still on his crate, wrists now cut free, rubbing one hand over the other with the mechanical movement of shock. 2 of the operators were down with injuries that looked manageable. Seraphine was standing in front of Hartwell. She wasn't touching him. She wasn't shouting. She was standing approximately 4 feet in front of him with her arms at her sides and her weapon holstered, and she was looking at him the way you look at something you are in the process of understanding for the first time, despite having known it for a very long time. Hartwell looked up at her. He was 71 years old, and he looked it right now. The quality of age made brutal by circumstance. His hands had stopped moving. His eyes, behind the glasses still hanging from his pocket, were the eyes of a man who had crossed a line and arrived on the other side of it and was now living in the reality of that arrival. "Seraphine," he said. His voice was wrecked. "Don't," she said. Quiet. Absolute. He closed his mouth. Damien came to stand beside her. She glanced at his face, at the cut on his cheek, and something passed through her expression and was gone. "Why?" she said to Hartwell, still quiet. The word contained no performance of emotion and therefore contained all of it. Hartwell looked at his hands. He was quiet for long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "They were going to expose my son," he said. The words came out with the terrible flatness of something that had been held too long. He got into something. A financial situation, offshore accounts, things I can't. They had everything. Complete documentation. Federal exposure, Seraphine, not civil, criminal. He looked up at her. "He's got 2 children. You gave them the summit location," she said. "Yes." "You gave them the trust documentation." "Yes." "You gave them the names." A pause. "The list in Hartwell's safe," Damien said from beside her. "The 26 names." "Yes," Hartwell said. It was barely a sound. Seraphine stood very still for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked 6 steps away from him and stood with her back to the dock, facing the hull of the moored vessel, and Damien watched her from the side and saw the effort that ran through her, top to bottom, like current through a wire. The effort of being the person who does not have the luxury of falling apart. He gave her the seconds she needed. Then he stepped to her side and he said quietly, "The summit location is compromised. The names are compromised. They move in 3 days." 2.5, she said. "By the time they process what Hartwell gave them and deploy," her voice was completely level. "And now they have the location, they'll change their approach. They won't just send an assault force, they'll send something designed to look like it belongs there." She paused. "Infiltration. They'll embed people among the delegates. Trojan horse. Inside a summit, I called." Her jaw tightened by a fraction. "Every family in the Eastern Territory in one room, and the network walking in among them in borrowed clothes." He looked at the phone in his hand. The network commander's phone, unlocked, its screen showing an active thread of encrypted messages in a language he didn't speak but whose operational shorthand was recognizable. He held it out to her. She looked at it, took it, scrolled through the thread with quick, precise movements, her eyes reading at speed. He watched her face while she read, and what he saw there was not fear exactly, but the concentrated intensity of someone absorbing information that changes the shape of everything and filing it, in real time, into the architecture where it will be used. She stopped on one message. "Read it twice." "There's a name here," she said. An operator they're embedding in the summit delegate roster." She looked up at him. "The delegation from the Northern families, the Kalasari group. The network has someone inside that delegation." She looked back at the screen. "A woman named Mira Voss." She said the name without visible reaction. Then she looked at Damien. "I know that name," she said. "Who is she?" "She was a council courier," Seraphine said, 3 years ago. I removed her from the network over a protocol breach." A pause. "I thought she was gone." "She wasn't gone," he said. "She went to them." "She went to them," Seraphine confirmed, and in her voice was the specific quality of a person recalculating a past decision and arriving at the cost of it. "Which means she knows the Council's internal verification protocols. She knows how delegates authenticate at summits. She can walk in as Kalasari's representative and nobody will question her. Unless someone who knows her face is at the door." She looked at him. "I'm not on the delegate list," she said. "I called the summit. I'm not attending it publicly." "You weren't," he said. The dock was quiet around them now, except for the movement of water and the sound of Renner's people managing the secured network operators 30 feet away. Hartwell was still on his crate, diminished and silent, the ruin of a 30-year relationship sitting in his gray suit. Damien looked at the cut on his own hand, the one he'd gotten on the dock board, the blood already drying and tacky. He looked at Seraphine with the cheek still running and his jacket torn at the shoulder and the cold of the harbor in all of him. "Tell me what you need for the summit," he said. She looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough to carry something in it. "I need to be visible," she said, for the first time. "I need to walk into that room as what I am, Not as what I've allowed people to believe I am, and I need to do it before Miravos reaches the delegate floor. She paused. And I need every person in that room to understand, before the network makes its move, exactly who called this summit and exactly what authority they're standing in. The reveal, he said. The reveal, she confirmed. And the network's people. Once they see you're not who they expected, they'll move early, she said. They'll improvise. They'll switch from infiltration to direct action the moment their cover is threatened. Her eyes were clear and without hesitation. Which is exactly what I need them to do. He understood. The trap was still the trap. Hartwell's betrayal had changed the shape of it, changed the timing, changed the personnel, but the trap was still there. She'd built it deep enough that even losing the surface layer didn't reach the mechanism underneath. The network thought they were bringing the trap down. They were still walking into it. The summit, he said. What haven't you told me about the location? She looked at him for 1 second with something that might, in another life, have been the beginning of a smile. The location Hartwell gave them, she said, is accurate. But the floor plan they'll use to plan their infiltration, she said, is 6 months out of date. She turned toward the dock exit, toward where Renner's people were waiting with 3 vehicles and a night's work still ahead of them. I had the interior redesigned in January. New egress points, new security architecture. Every corridor they've mapped for their exit routes now leads somewhere different than they believe. She walked toward the door. Damien stood still for 1 more second, absorbing the sheer layered completeness of it. Months of preparation, every contingency addressed, a redesigned building interior as an operational weapon. And then he followed her. Renner was at the vehicles. He took 1 look at Damien's face and at Seraphine beside him, and calibrated wordlessly, the way he always did. Hartwell? Renner said. Bring him, Damien said. Separately. He's not a prisoner, and he's not free. He's a problem for after. He looked at Renner. The summit is in 2.5 days. I need everything we have available, every reliable operator, every resource that hasn't been compromised. He paused. And I need a list of every person attending that summit as a Kalasari group delegate. Renner nodded. Already moving. Seraphine got into the passenger seat. Damien got behind the wheel. The harbor was behind them and the city ahead. And the darkness between had the quality of a space in which everything was about to change, in which all the separate threads of months and years were tightening toward the same point, in which 2.5 days had become the entire span of the world. He started the engine. His phone buzzed on the console between them. They both looked at it. The number on the screen was one he'd never seen before. Not unknown. It had a name attached to it in his contacts, a name that appeared in his records exactly once, from a call 3 years ago that had lasted 40 seconds and that he'd filed away as a wrong number from a woman who'd apologized and hung up. The name in his contacts read Mira Voss. He looked at Seraphine. Her face had gone to stone. He answered the call and put it on speaker. The voice on the other end was a woman's, and it was calm. And it was the calmness of someone who is calling from a position of information rather than disadvantage. Mrs. Vescari, the voice said. Not Mr. Vescari. I know you're there. A pause. I know about the port. I know about Hartwell. I know about the phone you took from my colleague. Another pause, and the voice changed register very slightly, colder, more deliberate, the performance of patience over something that was not patient at all. And I know about the redesigned floor plan. Seraphine's hand was on the door handle. The knuckles were white. I have a proposal, Miravos said. I think you should hear it before the summit. I think, if you don't... A brief silence, and in the silence, the sound of something in the background, low and continuous, and Damien recognized it after 2 seconds as the sound of many people in an enclosed space. I think the families attending your summit in 2 days are going to be very surprised by what arrives with them. The call was still open. Seraphine looked at the phone, then at Damien, then back at the phone, and her expression had the quality of someone standing at the exact threshold of a decision that cannot be unmade, the point at which every option that remains is a different kind of dangerous, and the only variable is which danger you choose. Seraphine took the phone off speaker. She held it to her ear, and she looked straight ahead through the windshield at the dark road and the amber wash of the port lights behind them, and she said, "Where?" Miravos gave an address. Seraphine said, "1 hour," and ended the call. Damien looked at her. She was already putting the phone down on the console with the deliberate care of someone managing the tremor in their hands by giving them a specific task. He watched her do it and said nothing. "She wants a meeting," Seraphine said. "I heard." "Alone." "No." She turned to look at him. Her face in the residual light had the quality of something that has been through heat, not broken, but changed at the molecular level, the original form still recognizable but irrevocably altered. "She'll have the location confirmed with people who'll pull out if they see more than one vehicle." "Then they'll pull out," he said. "Damien, I'm not sending you into a room with a network operative alone at midnight after everything that's happened in the last 8 hours. His voice was flat and not negotiable. "Tell me another way and I'll listen to it." She was quiet for a moment. "There isn't one," she said. "Then we find a way to make alone mean something different than she expects." He looked at Renner in the side mirror standing by the second vehicle 20 feet back. "I go in with you. 1 car. Renner holds the perimeter at 400 meters and doesn't move unless I signal." She looked at him for a long moment. The assessment in her eyes was the same quality it had always been. Complete, precise, without the softening that people usually applied when they were looking at someone they were invested in. But underneath it, for the second time tonight, there was something that wasn't calculation. "All right," she said. He drove. The address was a decommissioned rail depot 12 minutes north of the port, on a stretch of industrial shoreline that had been scheduled for redevelopment for 6 years and remained through various financial and political complications exactly as it had always been, wide, dark, and empty in the way that only places awaiting demolition managed to be. The kind of empty that is given up. He parked on the gravel apron outside the main structure, 1 car, as agreed. Renner's vehicles invisible at the agreed distance, Renner's voice in his earpiece saying simply, "In position," and going silent. The depot's main door was a sliding industrial panel, and it was open by 3 feet when they arrived, warm light coming through the gap from inside. Not overhead lights, something lower, portable. It was a deliberate staging of intimacy and control, the kind of environment arranged by someone who understood how space shapes conversation. Damien went in first. Seraphine came through immediately behind him. The interior was large and cold and smelled of rust and old machinery. The light came from 2 work lamps positioned near the center of the floor, creating a defined pool of visibility in a space that was otherwise dark in all directions. It was, he recognized, a room designed so that whoever was in the light couldn't see who might be in the dark. He moved to the left of the light pool rather than into it. Seraphine moved to the right. Miravos was already there. She was standing at the edge of the light, and she was younger than he'd expected. Mid-30s, dark hair cut close at the sides, wearing clothes that had no distinguishing features whatsoever, the operative's discipline of perfect visual neutrality. She was still and watchful, and when Seraphine came through the door, she looked at her with the particular attention of someone seeing a person they've thought about for a long time. She looked at Damien with a different expression. Assessment. Then, briefly, something that might have been surprise at his presence filed away without comment. "You brought him," she said to Seraphine. "I brought him," Seraphine said. Miravos absorbed this. "All right." She moved slightly, and the light shifted across her face, and Damien caught something there. Not nervousness, exactly, but the quality of someone carrying weight they've been carrying for long enough that they've adjusted to it, but haven't stopped feeling it. "You found the phone. You know what I know." "I know what was on the phone," Seraphine said, "which is what you wanted me to find." A pause. Miravos looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said. The depot was very quiet. "You left the commander at the port," Seraphine said. "You left him in a position where we'd take him and take the phone. The message thread with your name in it was put there by me. Mira said. This morning. Damien looked at Seraphine. Her expression had shifted by a fraction, recalibrating. You're not working for them, Seraphine said. It was not quite a question. I was, Mira said, for 14 months, embedded at your instruction, 3 years after you cut me out of the network. She paused, and in the pause was a compressed history of something complicated. You removed me over a protocol breach that I committed on purpose, to see what would happen to a compromised courier, to see who would approach me. She looked at Seraphine without accusation and without warmth. You built me as an instrument, just like you built Celeste. The difference is, I knew it. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. Why didn't you tell me? Seraphine said, quietly. Because you didn't ask. Mira said it without sharpness. You positioned me and you walked away and you didn't check back. And for 3 years I was outside the network waiting, and then the network approached me and I went in and I built my access and I sent you signals through channels I knew you monitored and you didn't respond. A breath. So I did it my way. The signals, Seraphine said. The shipping manifests. The port facility. I flagged the port 18 months ago through a courier alias you'd recognize. You identified the location through the manifests like you said. You didn't know it was me. A pause. That's when I understood how deep the compartmentalization had gone. You didn't know your own instrument was inside. Seraphine was very still. Hartwell, she said. I identified Hartwell 8 months ago, Mira said. I watched the network build pressure on his son over a financial matter that I suspect wasn't entirely organic. I think they manufactured the exposure specifically to create a lever against someone close to you. She looked at Seraphine directly. I tried to intercept it. I wasn't fast enough. By the time I had confirmation of his agreement to cooperate, he had already made the first contact. You could have come to me. With what? Mira said. Evidence that would require explaining who I was and what I'd been doing for 14 months inside an organization you didn't know I'd infiltrated? Walking into the council's communication channels as an unannounced ghost? She tilted her head slightly. You'd have had me killed before I finished the first sentence. Damien, who had been silent, said, What's the proposal? Mira looked at him, then back at Seraphine. The network's summit plan has 3 components, she said. Infiltration through the Kalasari delegation, that's me, and I can pull it. Internal disruption through Hartwell's documentation, which they now have. And an external assault force positioned to move when the interior team signals control of the room. She paused. The assault force is 12 people. They're currently positioned at a staging location I can give you. If you move on them before the summit, the plan collapses. And Hartwell's documentation, Seraphine said. They have copies, Mira said, not the originals. The originals are still at Hartwell's office. What they have is photographed material, enough to identify the names on your list and the account structures, but not enough for federal submission without the originals as authentication. She paused. As long as the originals don't reach them, and as long as the families on that list are warned and can initiate their own protective measures, the exposure is manageable. 26 people need to be moved, Seraphine said, in less than 2 days. 18, Mira said. 8 of them have existing protocols for exactly this situation. They'll self-execute. She met Seraphine's eyes. I've been in the network's planning sessions for 7 months. I know every name on the list they're targeting. I know which 8 are already covered. Seraphine looked at her for a long time. The 2 women stood in the pool of work lamp light in the cold depot and looked at each other, and Damien stood slightly outside that exchange and felt its weight, the weight of a relationship built entirely in absentia, through structures and proxies and deliberate silences. 2 people who had worked in the same invisible world without ever occupying the same room. Why the call tonight? Seraphine said. Why not earlier? Because earlier you were still inside the plan, Mira said. You still thought the summit could proceed as you designed it. If I'd come to you before Hartwell walked out, you wouldn't have needed what I have. You'd have managed me as a variable. A pause. I needed you to reach the point where the architecture had a gap I could fill. Damien thought about Seraphine telling him she'd needed him to remove her from the estate. He thought about the layers inside layers, The way everyone in this world seemed to operate in the same grammar of deliberate positioning and strategic patience. He wondered, briefly, if there was anyone in this entire chain of events who had done a single unrehearsed thing. Then he thought about the call he'd made from the hallway outside the library. Please. That one had not been rehearsed. Give us the staging location, Seraphine said, and the list of the 18 names. Mira Voss reached into her jacket. She produced a folded paper, handwritten, he noted, not printed, no digital trail, and held it out. Seraphine took it. One more thing, Mira Voss said. Celeste Arden called the network's primary coordinator 2 hours ago. She's offering information in exchange for extraction. She wants out of the city and out of whatever's coming. She paused. The coordinator agreed. They're moving her tonight. Seraphine looked at the paper in her hand. Where? Mira Voss gave a second address. Then she stepped back, out of the light pool and into the dark of the depot. And by the time Damien's eyes adjusted, she was gone. The sound of her departure, nothing more than the distant closing of a door he hadn't seen. He looked at Seraphine. She was looking at the paper. The summit, he said. Goes forward, she said. Exactly as planned, except I'll be in the room. She folded the paper. And Mira Voss will walk in as Kalasari's delegate, which means the network has no one on the inside. And their assault force won't have an interior signal. They'll be waiting for a code that never comes. She looked up at him, and while they're waiting, Renner's people will be behind them. She walked toward the door. He fell in beside her. Celeste, he said. I know, she said. You're not going to leave her to them. She was quiet for a step. 2 steps. No, she said. I'm not. They found Celeste at the second address, a service hotel near the transit hub, the kind of place that took cash and didn't remember faces. She was in a ground floor room with one bag packed and her coat on, sitting on the edge of the bed like someone who had been ready to leave for hours and was exhausted by the readiness. When Seraphine came through the door ahead of Damien, Celeste's face went through several expressions in rapid sequence, none of which she managed to suppress in time. Fear first, then something harder. Then, at the bottom of the stack, something that looked, briefly, rawly, like relief. She looked at Damien. You brought her, she said. She brought herself, he said. Celeste looked back at Seraphine, who had stopped in the middle of the room and was looking at her with the expression she used when she was deciding something. I called them, Celeste said, to Seraphine directly. Not confessing, stating. You know I called them. Yes, Seraphine said. I didn't know about you. Not everything. I knew you weren't who you appeared to be. I knew Damien had missed something fundamental, but I didn't know the scope. She paused. I was used. Yes, Seraphine said again. Celeste looked at her with something raw and complicated. Are you going to tell me you're sorry for that? No, Seraphine said. I'm not. The word landed cleanly, without cruelty, without apology. Celeste held it. You used me for years, Celeste said. I positioned you, Seraphine said. I gave you proximity to resources you wanted access to. I ensured that access came through Damien because Damien was the visible structure and you needed visible structures. She paused. I didn't manufacture what you felt or what he felt. I gave you the proximity. The rest was yours. The room was quiet. Celeste looked at Damien, who was standing near the door with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face giving nothing away. There was a cut on his cheek and his jacket was torn, and he looked like a man who had lived an entire year in the last 12 hours and was still upright through stubbornness rather than vitality. Did you know? Celeste asked him. Any of it? No, he said. She nodded slowly, like someone confirming something they'd already concluded. What happens to me? She said. Seraphine reached into her jacket and produced her phone and set it on the bed beside Celeste. There's a name in there, she said. A contact. She'll meet you at a location outside the city. She'll give you documentation and enough resources to build a new position somewhere that the network has no reach. She paused. That's what happens to you. Celeste looked at the phone. Why? Because you were used, Seraphine said, and because what was used in you, the ambition, the hunger for something larger than what you'd been given, those aren't failures. They're the reasons you were chosen. She looked at Celeste directly, woman to woman, with a clarity that had no performance in it. Go. Don't contact anyone from your previous life. Don't look for ways back in. Build something of your own that doesn't require anyone else's empire to support it. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone. She looked at Damien one final time. He met her eyes. Go, he said. She went. But the summit convened at noon 2 days later in a property in the west of the city, a renovated warehouse complex that had been redesigned 6 months ago and whose new interior the network's people had never seen. 12 families, 43 delegates, the full Eastern Territory represented in one room for the first time in 11 years. Damien arrived with his captains in the third wave of delegates. He wore a dark suit and no jewelry, and the cut on his cheek had closed to a thin red line that would scar. He sat at the table assigned to the Viscari Syndicate, and he waited. Mira Voss arrived as part of the Kalasari delegation at 12:20. She carried documentation that was perfect, passed 2 levels of authentication, and took her seat without attracting any attention from anyone except Damien, who tracked her entrance from the corner of his vision and watched her scan the room with the unhurried efficiency of someone taking an inventory she'd been trained to take. At 12:31, the room fell into the specific silence that precedes something formally significant, and Seraphine walked in. She came through the main entrance alone. No escort, no announcement, no architectural preparation of the moment. She walked in the way she walked through every room she had ever occupied, with the unhurried, complete sureness of someone who has never once questioned whether the space belongs to them. She was wearing black. Her hair was up. She wore no jewelry except a single ring on her right hand that Damien recognized, from a conversation years ago that he hadn't fully understood at the time, as her mother's ring, the one she'd inherited at 22 along with everything else. The room did not react immediately. There was a delay. The delay of a room that has registered something it hasn't yet processed. Then, one by one, around the full table, the seated delegates began to rise. Not because someone told them to, not because protocol demanded it, because the people in that room, every one of them operating at the intersection of power and survival, recognized, in the way that people who live by reading rooms recognize things, what had walked through the door. By the time Seraphine reached the head of the table, every person in the room was standing. Every person except 3. 3 men, members of different delegations spaced around the table in positions that were clearly not accidental, who had remained seated, whose hands were below the table line, and whose eyes had gone to each other in a sequence that took less than a second and that Seraphine did not appear to notice. She did notice. She stood at the head of the table and looked across the room with the expression he had first seen in the garden and had spent 4 years misreading, and she said, in a voice pitched for the full room and carrying in it no uncertainty whatsoever, "Thank you all for coming. Please sit down." They sat. "My name is Seraphine Vale." She paused 1 beat. Not Vescari, Vale. What that name represents to this room, and what authority it carries in this gathering, I'm going to ask you to set aside for the next 10 minutes while I address something more immediately relevant. She looked around the table slowly, and her gaze moved across every face, including the 3 who had remained seated last. There are people in this room who entered it in the service of an organization called the Heron Network. Their instruction was to signal a control sequence at a specific moment in these proceedings, at which point an external force would move on this building. The room was completely silent. "The external force," she said, "was neutralized at 4:30 this morning." She paused. "The signal has no one to reach." One of the 3 men moved. He was fast. The trained fast of someone who had made the decision before the moment arrived and was executing it rather than choosing it. He came out of his chair with a weapon drawn, and the trajectory of his movement was towards Seraphine, and the distance between them was 12 feet and closing. Damien was already moving at 8 feet. He came across the corner of the table and put himself between the man and Seraphine with 3 feet to spare and his hand on the man's weapon arm before the man could recalculate, and they went into the table together, wood cracking under the impact, and Damien got the gun free in the fall, and they hit the floor, and he came up with it, and the room erupted. The other two network operatives moved simultaneously. Both stopped immediately because Renner's people had been positioned invisibly in the room's architecture since 8 that morning. In the service corridor behind the east panel, in the space above the suspended ceiling over the northwest corner, and standing apparently as part of the catering staff that had been present in the room since the delegates arrived. 3 weapons appeared with the operatives as their targets, and the operatives understood the mathematics and stopped. 12 seconds. The entire action took 12 seconds. Damien stood up from the floor. His ribs were registering the table edge with a focused intensity that would become significant later. He was still holding the recovered weapon. He looked at Seraphine. She had not moved. She was standing at the head of the table exactly where she'd been standing, with her hands at her sides and her expression carrying the controlled, complete steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this possibility enough times that its occurrence was more confirmation than surprise. She looked at the room, at 43 people who were experiencing the specific recalibration of those who have just watched someone demonstrate, physically and without ambiguity, exactly what they claimed to be. She looked at Damien. He looked back at her. She said to the room without breaking from his gaze, "The Council's purpose has never been to rule you. It has been to provide the architecture within which you could operate without tearing each other apart." She finally looked away from him and back at the table. That architecture is intact. The threat to it is removed. And going forward, the terms of the Council's relationship with every family in this room are going to change toward transparency, toward mutual accountability, toward a structure where power is acknowledged rather than obscured. A pause. Because obscured power, as several of us have learned at some cost this week, is the most vulnerable kind. The room was still. Then the dawn of the oldest family at the table. A man in his 80s who had been present at every significant moment in the Eastern Territory's underworld history for half a century, put both hands flat on the table and inclined his head toward the head of the table. One by one, around the room, the other delegates followed. It took 4 hours to conclude the summit's actual business. Damien sat through most of it, which was not something he'd done before. Sat in a room where the real decisions were being made, where the actual shape of the world he occupied was being drawn and redrawn. He'd always been in the room next door receiving the conclusions. He understood now why that had been the arrangement, and he understood it without the bitterness he might have expected, because the bitterness required a version of himself he was finding harder to locate. After the families departed, the room was emptied by Renner's people. The 3 network operatives were taken out through the service corridor. The catering staff who were not catering staff quietly became themselves again. Seraphine sat at the table for a while after everyone had gone. Just sat, in the chair at the head of it, with her jacket on and her hands in her lap and the remains of the afternoon light coming through the high windows. Damien came back in after dealing with Renner and sat in the nearest chair, not at the head, just adjacent, and they were quiet for a moment in the way of people who have been in motion for a very long time and have arrived somewhere that allows for stillness. "Mira Voss," he said. "I've already spoken with her," Seraphine said. "She's being formally reinstated, with a different kind of access than before." A pause. "I owe her more than a reinstatement. I'm not sure yet what the adequate accounting of that looks like." He nodded. "Hartwell." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "He'll step away from the Council's legal structure. His son's situation will be addressed, not because he cooperated with the network, but because the exposure his son was under was manufactured, and manufactured pressure isn't a debt." She looked at her hands. "Hartwell himself? I don't know yet. Some things don't resolve cleanly." He understood this. He sat with it. "The syndicate," he said. "Mine, specifically." She looked at him. "I want to restructure it," he said, "into the Council framework, properly. Not as a protected asset operating with the fiction of independent authority, but as an actual component of an actual structure." He paused. "Which means I need to understand the structure, all of it, not the version you decide is safe for me to have." She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without flinching. "That's a significant commitment," she said. "I know what it is," he said. "I've had approximately 36 hours to understand exactly what I've been part of without knowing it, and I'm telling you I'd rather be part of it knowing. It changes everything about how you operate. she said. Visibility, risk, the nature of the decisions. Seraphine. He said her name the way he'd said please on the voicemail, unguarded, which was the only way either of them had left. I know, I'm asking. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. He exhaled. He hadn't noticed he'd been holding anything until he let it go. They sat for another minute in the empty room. The marriage, he said. She said nothing immediately. He watched her face and saw the care with which she was approaching the question. Not evasion, not preparation of a performance, just the genuine effort of a person being precise about something that mattered. I don't know, she said. Finally. Honestly, I know what we built. I know what it was for, and what it wasn't. And I know what the last 4 years were for both of us, and some of what they were was real, even if none of it was what it appeared. She paused. But I don't know how to rebuild something on honesty when the original structure was never built there. I don't know if you can. Another pause. I don't know if I can. He nodded slowly. That's a fair answer, he said. It's the only one I have. He looked at the long table, the scarred wood where they'd gone into it, the afternoon light moving across it. He thought about the garden. He thought about 4 years of misread silences and a gray silk wrap and bare feet on flagstone, and the particular quality of attention he had spent 4 years dismissing as absence. He thought about what it cost to keep a secret of that magnitude for that long, in a marriage, in a life, in the everyday repeated proximity of domestic existence. I don't need an answer now, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him. I mean that practically, he said. I have nowhere else to be. The syndicate restructuring is going to take months. The council framework. I'll need guidance, which means I'll need access to you professionally regardless of anything else. He paused. So I'm not going anywhere. And whatever else gets decided can get decided at the pace it needs. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, at the very corner of her mouth, the ghost of something moved. Not a smile exactly, but the possibility of one, which in Seraphine's economy of expression was significant. You've learned to be patient, she said. I've had a very instructive week, he said. 3 weeks later, Damien moved back into the estate. He had his own wing now, a formalization of what had always been an informal arrangement, the parallel tracks of 2 lives occupying the same property. But the formalization meant something that the informality hadn't: acknowledged terms, named realities, the particular dignity of things that are what they are rather than what they pretend to be. He learned the council's architecture slowly, the way you learn a language as an adult, through immersion and error and the gradual accumulation of intuition that supplements the grammar. Seraphine taught him in the way she did everything, precisely, without condescension, with the particular patience of someone who understood that the material was complex and that complexity required time rather than apology. He was good at it, which surprised neither of them, and which surprised him anyway. Renner transitioned into a dual role, Vescari security and council operational support, and adapted to this with the same wordless professionalism he applied to everything, adjusting his understanding of what the structure was with the efficiency of a man who had always suspected the structure was larger than he'd been shown, and was simply relieved to finally see the actual dimensions. Mira Voss became the council's primary external intelligence coordinator, a role she inhabited with the particular authority of someone who has earned their position in ways that don't fit on any official record. She and Seraphine worked in the same building for weeks before they had a conversation that wasn't strictly operational. When they finally did, it lasted 3 hours. And Damien, who encountered Seraphine afterward in the corridor outside the library, thought she looked, not lighter exactly, but more complete, as if something that had been load-bearing weight had been redistributed at last. Celeste sent one message, 6 weeks after the hotel room, through the contact number Seraphine had given her. The message was 2 sentences. It said she'd arrived somewhere new and that she was building something that was hers. It said she'd figured out what that meant. No return address, no request for response. Seraphine read the message and set the phone down and went back to whatever she'd been working on. Hartwell never returned to the council. He moved to a city 300 miles away to be near his son. And if he thought about what he'd done in the configuration of guilt and relief, that is the unique domain of people who've betrayed someone who forgave them anyway, he thought about it privately, in the way old men handle the things they cannot change. Muds. The morning Damien found Seraphine on the estate rooftop, it was just past dawn. He'd come up through the access door that he'd learned existed 3 weeks into his return, part of the structural inventory she'd walked him through with the same methodical completeness she brought to everything. He'd come up because he'd seen the roof access door ajar from the top floor corridor, which it never was, and his understanding of Seraphine's precision made an ajar door noteworthy. She was standing at the eastern parapet. The city was below and beyond, its morning layer of light and exhaust and ordinary life, conducting itself at the indifferent scale that cities maintain regardless of what any specific human being is doing in them. The sky was the particular gray-going gold of very early morning, and she was in it with her coat on and her hair down, which was unusual, the loose dark fall of it across her shoulders, and she was holding a coffee cup in both hands, and she was looking at the city. He came to stand beside her. Not close. The appropriate distance of two people who are in the process of figuring out what their distance should be. She didn't look at him. The access door was stiff, she said. I didn't close it fully. I know, he said. She looked at the city. He looked at the city. The light was changing at the speed that light changes when it's actually moving, and you're actually still enough to notice it. I come up here sometimes, she said. When something is finished. He looked at her profile. What's finished? She was quiet for a moment. The version of this where I hold everything alone, she said. I think that version is finished. He didn't say anything. He let it be what it was. She drank her coffee. The city moved below them in its usual way. Thousands of people beginning thousands of ordinary days, none of whom had any idea what the woman at the parapet of the building above them had built, or protected, or held together, or cost herself in the holding. None of whom would ever know. That was the nature of invisible work. It was most successful when it remained invisible, when the architecture held so well that no one ever had cause to look at it. He thought about that, about the particular loneliness of structures that work. He thought about what it had cost her, specifically over the years that he'd been standing inside the structure without knowing it was there. He thought about asking her. He decided not to, because some questions were not his to ask yet, and because the thing he wanted to communicate wasn't a question anyway. He reached over and took the coffee cup from her hands, and she let him take it, and he drank from it and handed it back. And she looked at him when she took it back with the expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else, but existed in the exact space between the two. And she looked back at the city. They stood there while the light continued to change. Below them, the city conducted its ordinary business. Above it, in the early morning on a rooftop that nobody was watching, the woman who had run everything and the man who was learning what that meant stood together at the edge of something that had not yet been named and watched the day begin. The empire held. It had always held. It would continue to hold through restructured alliances and new accountabilities and the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust in places where it had been broken. Not because it was invincible, but because the person who built it had never once, in all the years of building it, confused the work with the reward. The reward, if it came, would come later. In the quiet. In the ordinary morning light. In the kind of time that doesn't belong to strategy or survival, but to something simpler and harder and more worth protecting than any empire ever built. The sun finished rising. Seraphine finished her coffee. She turned from the parapet and she walked toward the access door. And before she reached it, she paused and looked back at him. And what she said was small and ordinary and landed in his chest with the weight of everything that had come before it. Come inside, she said. I'll make breakfast. He looked at her, at the city behind her, at the morning. All right, he said, and he followed her in.